We are so grateful to have Dr. Zhong as our interviewee today, and we are going to interview him some questions about his research for more than 40 years. So our first question is about, first of all, I know you were born and raised in the United States, and your education and culture have little connection with China. So what made you want to explore Chinese culture?
I got interested in China in the late 1960s, and that was the period of the war in Vietnam. Yes. The U.S. was involved in this long military conflict in Vietnam. And I suppose that I'd had several impressions of China prior to the Cultural Revolution. But I suppose the thing that first interested me in China was an article, or a series of actually 2 articles in Life magazine by Ma Sitsong. Ma Sitsong was a Chinese violinist who had escaped from China during the Cultural Revolution by swimming to Hong Kong.
Yeah, and that's right.
He had brought a number of color photos of the Cultural Revolution in Beijing.
That's right.
And I was impressed by the Daziba, these big character posters, pasted up all over the Temple of Heaven, of all places, because I'd been a stamp collector as a kid, and I saw stamps. The very last issue of the Qing Dynasty had a picture of the Temple of Heaven on it. Xuan Tong Sannian, that was 1911. And so, seeing it with these big character posters and these red guards running around and then crowning, bureaucrats with these tall paper hats and so on and so forth, seemed really, really zany, but at the same time inconceivable that this type of thing would happen, because of course when you grow up in America you get the impression that communist countries are highly controlled, right?
There's
and
a
highly
big
controlled,
difference.
but this is total chaos.
Right?
So I was thinking, major things are going on in China that we don't know too much about. And I remember going into high school the following year. That would have been probably the summer after 9th grade, so that was the summer when I had just completed junior high school. So the next year I went into high school, and I remember we were having a class in geography. And I remember the teacher was talking about the war in Vietnam, and he said, well, the war in Vietnam is basically a war to contain China. It's a war against China because we've already killed most of the young men in North Vietnam, so it's the Chinese who are fighting us now. And I was a bit suspicious of this explanation, so I remember I raised my hand and I said, Mr. Cortez, I think his last name is Cortez. Mr. Cortez, if the Chinese are fighting us in Vietnam, why are they having something in their own country like the Cultural Revolution, which seems to me to be a wide-scale civil war? I mean, isn't the United States a powerful country? Shouldn't they be concentrating on the war effort? And his response was, I haven't heard about the Cultural Revolution. I don't know what's going on in China. So I was just thinking, if Americans are so ignorant about what's going on in East Asia, how can they survive in the modern world? So one of the things I wanted to do was learn more about East Asia in order to help Americans better understand what they were getting into. I mean, the Vietnam War was a mistake. It was a morass which the U.S. couldn't get out of, right? And of course, talking about anecdotes, supposedly when Nixon first went to meet Chairman Mao in Beijing, the first thing that they talked about was the Vietnam War. Nixon said, we've come here to see if you could help us extricate ourselves from Vietnam. And this was translated to Chairman Mao, and Chairman Mao laughed and said, we invited you here to see if we couldn't persuade you to stay. Because the idea was that China was afraid that Vietnam would become an ally of the Soviet Union. And there was a lot of tension between China and the Soviet Union at the time. There were these border skirmishes. So, I mean, these were things that were beyond the imagination of ordinary American people. So I thought that this is something that's well worth studying. And I realized at the time, of course, that Chinese language was really the Latin of the Orient, right?
Yes, right.
The Chinese characters were used in Korea, in Japan,
Yes.
in the Ryukyu Kingdom, in Taiwan, in Southeast Asia, all these places. So that if I wanted to gain better insights into East Asia, I should learn Chinese.
Yeah.
So that was part of the motivation of studying Chinese. The other motivation was I had been reading about China after I saw those two articles in Life magazine. I started reading one book called China in Revolution, and that was edited by a woman called Vera Simone. It was a series of translations of important Chinese writings probably since the Opium War up until the 1950s. And from that, I got on to Edgar Snow. Edgar Snow's book, Xixing Ma Ji, Red Star Over China. And I read that and was very impressed by these stories of the Long March and the biography of Mao Zedong and Zhu De and Zhou Enlai and Deng Yingchao and all of these people. After that, that was in the summer that I read that book. After that, I went home because I was spending my summers in Conneaut Lake, which is the northern part of Pennsylvania. I went home and I went to my local library and I got another book by Edgar Snow called The Other Side of the River. That was written about Snow's revisit to China in the early 1960s before the Cultural Revolution. And in that book, there was a bibliography at the end, a list of sources and so on, and recommended books. And I remember in the text he mentioned Lu Xun several times as a great Chinese writer. And I saw that it was possible to order some of Lu Xun's writings in English translation from a bookstore in San Francisco called China Books and Periodicals, which was an outlet for Guoji Shudian for Beijing at the time. And I remember ordering a selection of his fiction and two books which were selections of his essays. And I remember starting to read Lu Xun in English translation and being very, very impressed by it. I didn't really understand it, but of course I liked the introduction. Naha, that's huge, right?
Oh, yes, I know that.
Yeah, the introduction to Outcry by the author himself,
Yeah.
and all these interesting anecdotes about being a medical student at Sendai and seeing this slideshow in which a Chinese person accused of being a military scout for the Russians is being beheaded, and all of the Chinese people sort of standing around just taking in the beheading as a spectacle, and Lu Xun's consternation as he tells it. Of course, later on, some scholars have argued that this is fiction in part, that he made some of this up. I don't think he made all of it up. I think that there's certainly a basis in his own experience in the anecdote. But I mean, the whole idea then that he could use literature to somehow help the Chinese people better understand the world and better understand reality and in the process also become better people, better citizens. This is something that impressed me. His idea that literature had great transformative power. I think that's something that impressed me. I read Kwang Ji when I was in high school in English translation, Diary of a Madman. He keeps talking about shiren, right, eating people, right? And I knew it was a metaphor for something, but I didn't know what it was. So when I ended up taking Chinese language class for the first time, that was right before I went to Columbia University because I was accepted at Columbia. And the reason I applied to Columbia was you could do a major in Oriental Studies in those days, what we now call Asian Studies. So the summer before, I took first year Chinese in a summer session at the University of Pittsburgh. And my first Chinese teacher happened to be a man called Tai Eugene, who was the son of Tai Jingnong, who had been one of Lu Xun's students.
Wow, a coincidence.
Yeah, a coincidence. Not only a Lu Xun student, but he was also a collaborator with Lu Xun and Wei Mingshui in Beijing, and they kept up their friendship for quite a number of years. So I remember one day when we had a break from language study, I asked the teacher, I said, how did I put it? Have you heard of Lu Xun? The Chinese writer Lu Xun, and he said, Lu Xun. He was surprised that I even mentioned the name. He said, Lu Xun. Lu Xun 到过我家，我父亲认识鲁迅。Lu Xun came to my home. My father knew Lu Xun, and I guess I acted surprised or something like that. And then he said, 我肚皮上还有个疤。是鲁迅喝茶的时候不小心把茶倒到我的肚子上。You know, I've still got a scar here on my stomach. When Lu Xun was in our house one day, he was not very careful with a hot cup of tea, and he splashed me with it. I still got a scar. Do you want to see it? He started taking his shirt off, and I said, no, that's quite all right. I believe you, because I think I'd said something like, I don't believe it, meaning that's an incredible coincidence that, you actually knew Lu Xun. But then I moved on to the question. I said, look, I was reading Diary of a Madman, and he keeps talking about cannibalism, about eating people. That's a metaphor, isn't it? What's it a metaphor for? Yeah. What is it a symbol for? And I said, is it about 帝国主义要吃掉中国，要瓜分中国? Is it about imperialist countries wanting to devour China or divide up China like it were a melon? Yeah. And he said, no, it's not about that. It's about Chinese society. It's about a certain type of person in Chinese society. And I remember he sort of looked around the class to see if the other students were following what we were talking about. Most of them had no idea what we're talking about, so he just cut it short there. And I'm very sorry until this day that I never went to his office to talk more about Lu Xun. Yeah. And that's been a big regret. And then subsequently, after I graduated university, I went to Taiwan for more study. And it turned out that his father was the head of the Chinese department at Taida, at Taiwan University. So I wanted to go to talk to his father. But then everybody said to me, all my friends said to me, and some of my teachers, 不要去找他, don't go looking for him. 他不愿意讲关于鲁迅的任何事情. He's not willing to talk anything about Lu Xun, because of course Lu Xun's works were banned in Taiwan at that time under the Kuomintang, under the Chiang Kai-shek dictatorship. So he avoided talking about Lu Xun. Nevertheless, until this day, I regret not going there. Because if I'd gone to his house and presented myself as his son's only student in Taiwan, I think he would have welcomed me. And I heard he liked to drink. And I think probably we would all sit around drinking, and eventually his friends would leave and I would be there alone. Yeah. And then he would start talking about Lu Xun. Yes. But I didn't do that. When I was young, I didn't have much self-confidence. And I regret that until the present day that I never had that chance to talk to Tai Jing-nong about Lu Xun. So have I said enough in response to the first question?
I learned a lot from this. No, and the second question is, what was your journey of learning Chinese culture like? That's a long journey, as we know.
Well, as I said, I got interested in China through reading in English, reading about China, then reading Lu Xun in English translation. I went to Columbia to major in Oriental Studies. The undergraduate education there was okay. I wouldn't say it was fantastic. I studied with a famous professor, and that was Xia Zhiqing, who was an expert in modern Chinese literature. Yes. Xia Zhiqing did not like Lu Xun, though, because like much of the right wing of the Kuomintang, they considered Lu Xun to be subversive, right? Somebody who criticized the warlord government, criticized Jiang Jieshi, criticized the Kuomintang, and as a result, deflated them in the eyes of the Chinese readership, and subsequently led to the communist victory. So Lu Xun then was seen as somebody who'd done something horrible, right? So he didn't appreciate Lu Xun. And I realized that, and so I never talked to him about Lu Xun until much later, when I'd written my master's thesis somewhere else on Lu Xun's poetry.
Okay.
And I sent him a copy of the thesis, and he said, well, you did something good because you studied an aspect of Lu Xun that no one else studies.
Wow.
And that's original.
Yes.
So that's the only good thing that Xia Zhiqing ever said to me about my study of Lu Xun. You did something that other people don't do, and that's original. So in that sense, he was encouraging to me. Xia Zhiqing was also encouraging to me later. When I was doing my PhD at the University of California in Berkeley, after I'd done my coursework and my exams, I got a fellowship from the National Academy of Sciences to go to Beida. So when I was at Beida, I was auditing some courses, but I was also trying to work on my PhD thesis. And my topic got changed on me. Originally, I wanted to work on Lu Xun's early essays. The essays he wrote in 1907 and 1908, like 莫洛诗里说,文化偏之论,破生论, when he was finishing his period of study in Japan. That was my original PhD thesis topic. But later on, some people in my department back in Berkeley said, this topic is no good, because these are articles of criticism. They are not belles lettres.
Yeah.
You should write a dissertation either on fiction or on poetry, some kind of creative work in this department, not on literary criticism. So I had to change my topic, and I decided, with the advice of my main professor, my supervisor at the time, an Englishman called Cyril Birch, I decided to change the topic to the poets who were prominent in China prior to Lu Xun, prior to the May 4th era. And I ended up going back to these three groups of poets in the late Qing and early Republic, who were conservative poets in that they were not intentional innovators like Huang Zunxian. Huang Zunxian wrote in classical style poetry, but he intended to be an innovator. He intended to bring in new vocabulary and new ideas and so on. The people that I worked on were not that way. There were essentially three different schools. One is called Nigu Pai, the neoclassical school. A representative would be Wang Kaiyun. Another one was called the Zhongwantang Shi Pai, the poetry school which was influenced by the mid to late Tang poetry. And then the final group was usually known as Song Shi Pai, the Song poetry school, but I think more accurately it's called Tongguang Ti, the style of the Tongzhi and Guangxu reign eras. So the three different groups of poets writing in old style poetry. But what I argued in my PhD thesis was that they articulated modern sensibilities, modern reactions to the world, the idea that the Chinese world order was changing profoundly in a way that people had not imagined before. And I mean, really, that's the essential definition of modernity in Western poetry, too. You look at people like Ezra Pound or T.S. Eliot, they were articulating the same thing, that the world has changed after World War I in profound ways. We're never going to be able to go back to the old belief systems. And in Western literary criticism, I suppose you can even push this back farther to Matthew Arnold on Dover Beach, the idea of ignorant armies clash in the night, the idea that the old belief system has collapsed and is gone. And what we're looking at is an entirely new world, which is not necessarily an attractive one. So C.T. Xia, at the point I went to Beida, he and I were still corresponding. I would write to him and he would write back to me. And one of the things he said to me was, he said, if you want to work on poets of the old schools, get a hold of Qian Jibo's 中国现代文学史, modern history of modern Chinese literature written by Chen Jibo. And I found that book in the Beidao Library, and I started to read it. But I also found out Chen Jibo is the father of Qian Zhongshu. So I ended up writing a letter to Qian Zhongshu, basically saying, sorry to bother you, but I got a hold of your father's book, and I'm trying to study the poets of the late Qing, and I'm wondering if you think that these three groups that he selected are still the most representative. And I'm wondering if you think that I might not write on the innovators like Huang Zunxian or even more recent Liu Yazi. I had no idea Qian Zhongshu hated Liu Yazi. So he immediately wrote me back and said, don't write on Liu Yazi. He's a poetaster. He's what do you call that? A poseur as a poet and so on. But this interested him. So we continued to correspond, and eventually Qian Zhongshu invited me to come to his apartment. So I came to his apartment in the company of another American, a man called Nat Wallace, who was actually became a professor of English literature somewhere in the American South. So I had an evening of conversation with Qian Zhongshu. And Qian Zhongshu said, I don't normally see foreign visitors. But he says, I invited you here because you wrote me about scholarly topics. That's what you had to talk about, and so for that reason I invited you over. And then at the end of the evening I also got to meet his wife, Yang Jiang. Yang Jiang herself was a great scholar and also a wonderful writer. So it was really quite an interesting meeting and very fortuitous, very fortunate opportunity to meet both Qian Zhongshu and Yang Jiang. And that, of course, came out of my correspondence with Xia Zhiqing. So my relationship with Xia Zhiqing went on long after I had graduated Columbia. Yeah. And I think that that's one important thing about Chinese culture that we're losing in the contemporary Western academic scene, and that is that in Chinese culture, oftentimes the relationship between a student and a professor, or between a student and a teacher, is a lifelong one.
Yes.
It goes on and it goes on.
Yes.
It doesn't finish. Here and in the West, it becomes a business meeting. You know, we meet, you know, I tell you what you have to do, you do it, I give you a grade, then you go away and you never contact me again, or unless you need a recommendation or something like that. Right. But I think in Chinese culture, it's a much more important relationship, and I've experienced that in my own life. I'm not saying that my teachers told me everything to do, and I just went off and did that. I don't want to give you that impression, but I do want to give you the impression that I benefited a lot from their wise counsel and their advice.
Oh, so that's the long journey.
It's a long journey.
Yes.
Yeah.
And for our next question, so you have done a lot of in-depth research in Chinese culture. So what has been and is the focus of your scholarship and the research?
Well, the original focus was Lu Xun, and I wanted to work on Lu Xun's classical style poetry because it was a topic which other people had not studied. There was a Japanese scholar who wrote a short book on it, and I did force myself to read much of that book. My Japanese is not good. Yeah. I started studying Japanese in my mid-20s. Unlike Chinese, I started studying Chinese when I was 17. So I was still quite young at that time. Japanese has always been a stumbling block for me because the grammar is very different from Chinese. Yes. There's a saying among Chinese students about studying Japanese, 我们是笑着进去，哭着出来. We were smiling when we went in and started studying it, but we were crying at the end because it gets more and more difficult as you go. Chinese is a bit different. You know, as an English speaker, when you start to study Chinese, it's very hard. You know, the tones, we don't have tones in English, you have to memorize the tones, the characters, they're very difficult for us to remember. But once you get past those two hurdles, it starts to get easier.
Yes.
Unlike Japanese, where it just gets more and more complicated. But anyhow, back to the question at hand. I got interested in Lu Xun's classical style poetry initially because I thought that through his poetry I could get closer to his inner mind, to his inner thoughts, and I believe I did. One critic, a professor called Kirk Denton at Ohio State University, wrote a review of my book and said, "You didn't do that," because Lu Xun in his classical style poetry is very formal, and he's very distant, and it's the same as the Lu Xun that you read in his Zawin and his essays. There's nothing personal about it. But see, his definition of personal is different from my definition of personal. When he thinks of personal, he thinks of like personal relations, like his love life or something like that. I don't think that that's my definition of personal. I mean, personal has to do with his relationship with society, with his country, with his culture, but also with his friends. Dao Rou Shi, one of the poems that he wrote is mourning Rou Shi, who was executed illegally by the Kuomintang. Rou Shi was a young writer who was one of his students. Rou Shi wrote 二月, 早春二月. This is one of the movies I teach in Chinese cinema.
Watched.
You watched it,
Yes,
and of course.
yes.
Yeah, and you also saw a picture of Rou Shi at the beginning, too. I think he was only 29 or 30 when he was killed. So, I mean, to me, this is part of Lu Xun's inner thoughts. This is part of Lu Xun's inner mind. What went through his mind and his heart when he got the news of Rou Shi's execution, and the other, they're called 左联, 五个烈士, what went through his mind. Well, that's all there in this poem, 道柔石. 关于长夜过春时. This is how it starts off, and talks about him standing in the yard of this Japanese inn and hiding in Shanghai, and all the things that he's thinking after the death of Rou Shi. So I do think that his classical poetry does get you closer to Lu Xun.
Yes.
But I mean, that's not the only reason why you should study his classical poetry. I mean, in many ways, Lu Xun's works document the history of the revolution, and I've said that to the media on mainland China. 革命的历史就在这儿, right? If you want the young people to understand the Chinese Revolution, have them read Lu Xun. Don't act like those puppet authorities in Hong Kong, banning Lu Xun and saying, well, Lu Xun 他是煽动群众. 煽动革命, well, 共产党就是从这个革命出来的, right? So the Communist Party itself arose from this revolution, and Lu Xun was one of the thinkers behind it. One of the people who said China needs real change. And I think that's what the revolution is about. Righting injustice, setting injustice right. That's the reason for the revolution. And it's not to kill people, and I think he said that as well. Well, how far have I gotten in answering that question?
It's okay. So our fourth question, let's go to the fourth one. So so you have talked about Lu Xun. Yes, so what do you think of Lu Xun's literary style attainments and literary achievements based on your research and studies?
Well, his literary style changes. When he was a young man writing in Japan, the first things that he published were these translations from Western literature, which he'd done through the vehicle of Japanese translations, right? Translations of Victor Hugo and Jules Verne, and that was fiction. That were the two things he translated, science fiction by Jules Verne. One was Journey to the Center of the Earth, and I think the other one was the Journey to the Moon. That style was written largely in Baihua Wen, so he was very early on, that was in his early 20s, he was interested in promulgating vernacular Chinese style. Later, after he became a student of Zhang Taiyan's during his final years in Japan, he reverted to a very archaistic style of Guwen, and that's the style that he wrote Mo Lo Shi Li Shuo Wen Hua Pian Zhi Lun and Po Sheng Lun in. It's difficult at first, it's challenging at first. And he liked to write these ancient forms of certain characters, and that made it even more difficult to read. A lot of those characters have been changed in the modern editions of Luxun Quanji, but if you go back to the old magazine Henan, you can see some of these ancient stock characters that he used. It was a very challenging style, but when you get used to it, if you read it for a long time, I think it has a certain resonance to it.
Yeah.
It has a cultural resonance and a depth to it that you don't find in a lot of other writings at that time. So I think that's the thing that impresses me about that now. That impressed me when I was an undergraduate, when I first started reading Luxun in the original. There was a wonderful textbook called A Luxun Reader, which was created by a professor at Stanford called William A. Lyle. And he had annotated a number of Luxun's short stories, and including the novella Akyu Zhengzhuan. That's actually when I began to appreciate reading in Chinese, because prior to that, I had always found study of Chinese language a chore, a difficult task.
Yes.
But when I started reading Luxun in the original with this wonderful vocabulary list and notes compiled by William Lau, I began to realize that Luxun uses words in interesting ways. Luxun can pull you into the study of Chinese language and literature because what he writes is just so intriguing. And so I think that helped me along as well. There are some people now on the internet who complain about Luxun's style, right?
Yes.
They say that,
Yes.
What is this? How can anybody write like this? This doesn't make any sense. I think to a certain extent the people who write that are just jealous. They're jealous of the fame and the prestige that Luxun achieved. And I think they are also very short-sighted. Because they forget that the Baihua Wen that Luxun was writing in 1917, 1918, early 1920s, this was a period when Baihua Wen was in formative stages. So because it was in formative stages, it's naturally going to be very different from the Baihua Wen that we write today. And if you don't understand that, hey, what hole did you crawl out from? I mean, really, this is a basic facet of language and literature. I mean, you look at Shakespeare.
Yeah.
A lot of the stuff that Shakespeare writes is not easily understandable by readers of contemporary English.
Yes.
But we don't denigrate it. We don't make fun of Shakespeare because he used 5 different spellings for his own last name. We don't sneer and say, look, he couldn't even spell. That's just the way things were. Spelling rules in those days were fluid. You could spell something any way you wanted as long as people could understand it. So I don't appreciate that type of internet criticism of Luxun's style. His style in his short stories is different from his style in Yecao, in Wild Grass, which is sometimes called prose poetry. I don't know if it's prose poetry. To me, it's more like poetic prose. But I mean, that type of Baihua Wen in Yecao is much closer to the Baihua Wen of today, right? So I mean, his style changes, but that's just the nature of writing. He wrote over many decades. He started writing in 1902, 1903, as soon as he started translating science fiction, all the way up until the time he died, 1936. So you're talking 3 or 4 decades there. And these were decades that were really crucial in Chinese history. Not just in Chinese history and Chinese politics, but also in the evolution of Chinese literature. The whole Baihua Wen, movement started with the New Culture movement, and that then chimed in with the 1919 May 4th movement and so on. And this is a period of great change. So when you read Lu Xun today, you have to take that into account.
Yes. So, thanks for sharing about Lu Xun. Yeah, we really have learned a lot from this. And next, your second published book titled The Subtle Revolution: Poets of the Old Schools During Late Qing and Early Republic in China. It's about modernity's entry into China's letters, introducing a gentle heresy in the history of Chinese literature. And it describes representative figures from three major Chinese poetic schools, roughly from 1871 to 1914. So can you tell us the main content of this work?
It's been called a gentle heresy, I think, because it challenges the previous idea that modernity or a modern consciousness came into Chinese literature first through translation of Western works or through Western plays, which were translated and performed in places like Shanghai and Beijing.
Yes.
What I've argued in the second book, The Subtle Revolution, is that modernity first entered Chinese literature through the vehicle of classical Chinese poetry. Because classical Chinese poetry was it was the type of literature which was composed by the elite among writers, among thinkers, among intellectuals. And what happened is the world was changing, and these poets, be they Wang Kaiyun, be they Fan Zengxiang, Yi Shunding, Chen Sanli, Chen Yan, Zheng Xiaoxu, they articulated this sense of change in the world and in the Chinese view of the world. And also this idea that the world is changing in ways which we've never experienced before, and the old belief systems are no longer viable. So we are facing a whole new order. It's not necessarily a comfortable feeling. This is modernity as it's described in Western poetry, right? I mentioned before T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and on Dover Beach. So in that sense, if we take the definition of modernity, which the Westerners apply to Western literature, and apply that to Chinese literature, I think it is quite clear that these poets of the old schools were already at that level. At least as early as the Westerners, if not earlier, principally because China really felt the brunt of the Industrial Revolution with the imperialist advances against China. And one of the most important works in the book is this long poem written by Wang Kaiyun. It's called Yuan Ming Yuan Si, an ode to the Yuan Ming Yuan, the old summer palace outside Beijing, which of course was burned and sacked by the Anglo-French expedition during the Second Opium War. That was 1861. An interesting part of it is Wang Kaiyun, the poet, went to see the ruins of Yuan Ming Yuan 10 years later in 1871, and he also interviewed people living in the area. I think that's called Zhongguancun, or is that today it's near Beidai. It's just between Beidai and the new summer palace, Haidian. He interviewed people there, and he got his own idea of what happened, and then he wrote that up into poetry. But I mean, much of it is about the tragedy of the sack of Yuan Ming Yuan. But the thrust of the poem is to say the world is changing.
Yes.
And what are we going to do about it? How are we going to deal with this? Because what we thought was the case in the past is no longer the case. So I think that you can see the entry of a modern consciousness there. Fan Zengxiang, one of the representatives of this 中晚唐诗派, the school, which was influenced by the poetry of the mid to late Tang. He wrote 2 lengthy poems called Cai Yuan Qu. This is the song of Rainbow Cloud, and Cai Yuan, of course, is based loosely on the historical character Cai Jinhua. So the first of the 2 poems tells the story about her rising from sing-song boats in Suzhou to marrying this very accomplished member of the scholar gentry class, Hong Jun, who is later sent by the Qing dynasty as their representative to the court in Berlin. He was the equivalent of the Qing dynasty's ambassador to Berlin then, and Cai Jinhua going along with him. And this, of course, is all true historically, but there's embellishment. There's this idea that Cai Jinhua had trysts with a German officer in the Tiergarten, that's the zoo in Berlin. And then the second part, the second poem, Cai Yun Hou Qu, talks about her returning to China after the death of her husband, being kicked out by his family, going back to her old trade in Beijing, and then the Gengzi, the year 1900, with the Boxer Rebellion and then the occupation of Beijing by the Baguo Lianjun. Cai Jinhua going and meeting Waldersee again, who was the officer she supposedly had trysts with in the Tiergarten in Berlin, and Cai Jinhua and Waldersee taking up residence in the Forbidden City like the Emperor and the Empress, and Cai Jinhua then telling Waldersee what to do, advising him on everything. Don't burn Liu Lichang, because the people in Liu Lichang, those scholars, they were against the Yi He Tuan to begin with. So if you burn Liu Lichang, you just punish them. So just leave it alone. And so apparently, according to the story, he did that. He was listening to Cai Jinhua. And then, of course, the whole thing ends with him being sent back to Germany and her staying on in China. But again, the idea is posed of the whole traditional world order collapsing. And what is going to happen? Well, Cixi Taihou takes the Guangxu Emperor and they flee to Xi'an. So they're out of the picture. Who protects China? Who protects Beijing? Well, somebody like Cai Jinhua, who's a commoner, then comes to the fore and says, "Look, we got to do this, that, and the other thing. I'm going to go to Waldersee and say, do this, don't do that." And so she rises to the occasion. And in a way, of course, this is a criticism of the Qing court. What did Cixi Taihou do? Stupidly supported the Boxers, even though her best ministers, like Yuan Chang and others, Li Hongzhang, all these people said, don't do it, don't do it. She did it anyhow, and then look at the consequences. So again, I think the poem says a whole lot about the modern situation, but it also says a lot about modern consciousness. And then, finally you get into the Song Shi Pai, which are, in a way, more subtle. I mean, the first 2 groups are very romantic and very dramatic in their verse, and the Song Shi Pai are more hanxu. They're more subtle, but yet they also talk about profound change. One of the poems that Chen Sanli wrote was about the 1911 revolution and about the destruction, the human cost when troops run wild over a civilian population. And this very much anticipated the beginning of the warlord era, this Jinfa period. So I mean, in that sense, I think that there's definite indications of modernity there too. So have I said enough on that topic?
Okay, thank you. And next, it is not an easy decision to learn Chinese to you and adapt to a different culture and study in different regions and universities. So what challenges you the most in the process of learning?
Well, I think I've already said 方块字, Hanzi, of course, for a foreign student are a big challenge.
Yes.
But once you've got by that, I think the other big challenge is, well, Chinese history is vast. Even modern history is quite complicated.
Yes, yes.
You look, there's so many different opinions of Lu Xun now. I think another challenge, of course, is how do you articulate this? How do you explain this to a Western audience?
Yes, that's right.
I mean, in theory, when I went into this, I was going to teach American students ultimately. And I did do that at Williams College for quite some time. The problem is that many of those students didn't have any kind of a commitment to learning more about China. They didn't, for instance, take Chinese language. We had some Chinese language students, but they didn't necessarily study literature or history, because then there was this idea, well, learn Chinese language and go over to China and do business. But it's difficult to do business without knowing much about the culture or the history. So, I mean, there are a number of different problems. I mean, there are challenges everywhere, but I think that one of the most important challenges is, how do you bring this all home? How do you use it to try to engage and challenge the Western audience? And I think that Jonathan Spence, as a historian, did quite a good job of popularizing certain aspects of Chinese history with these incredible books that he wrote that interested readers. I think the movie The Last Emperor did a lot to convince the Western viewer that China indeed has a very interesting modern history if you would just go and delve more into it. But I think the big question is, how do you get Westerners to approach China in a way that allows them to learn something new, allows them to become more flexible, and yet allows them to see China on equal terms?
Yes.
I think that's a big challenge as well.
Okay, so in addition to the hardships of your research and the challenges, and believe you must have some special experiences. So please share an interesting anecdote in your learning process.
Well, I've already told an anecdote about being at first-year Chinese at the University of Pittsburgh and Taijing Nong San Tai Jian, and the spilling of the tea by Lu Xun on his stomach, and I suppose that counts as an anecdote. Can we use that?
Yes, sure.
Good.
And also, so next, has study Chinese culture changed or deepened your understanding of certain aspects of China and the world?
Yeah, I think it has. For one thing, I learned that China is actually it's a multicultural and linguistic state. China today is really the remnants of the Qing dynasty's empire, by and large, minus Outer Mongolia, of course. When you look at ancient Chinese philosophy, you find a pluralistic situation. It wasn't just Confucianism, there was also Taoism, right? Daojia Sixiang, Lao Zhuang. There's also Mojia, right? There's Moism. There's also Fajia. There's legalism. It was really a plurality of ideas. It was really 100 schools of thought, as Chairman Mao later said. So, I mean, in that sense, you realize that China is not, it's not what is the word? It's not an Ian Tang, right? It's not just one person speaking and everybody else listening, right?
Yes.
It's not just, well, I mean, one of the bad images of China that they had in America when I was a kid is that China is it's a nation of ducks. Everybody is following the leader in a line.
Yes.
And I think when you study about China, when you study Chinese history, Chinese culture, you realize it's not that way at all.
Yes.
There was a lot of contention. Chairman Mao made an interesting observation once. He said, a lot of people generalize about China and say the Chinese people like peace. He said, but I think they like to fight. But I think when he said they like to fight, I think he was talking about they like argument, they like different ideas.
Yes.
It is not monolithic, that's the word I was looking for. China is not monolithic. And I think when you study Chinese culture, it's a great, as Simon Leys, as Pierre Rickmans, the former professor of Chinese at Sydney Uni once said, the study of China is actually the greatest challenge to Eurocentricism. Right, because if you study China, you realize that Europe was not the center of the world. It was not in the past, and it will not be again in the future.
Okay, so although you have made the great achievements in Chinese studies, you are still delving into this discipline. So can you introduce the topics you are currently researching or planning to research in the future?
Okay, I've been working on a couple of topics. One of the topics, as I've hinted already, is Lu Xun's early essays. These essays he wrote in 1907 and 1908 in Japan. 莫罗实力说 on the power of Mara poetry, 文化偏执论 on imbalanced cultural development, and also 破恶生论, a refutation of the noxious voices of evil, or however you want to translate that. I'm interested very much in his early thought and the development of his thinking in Japan, and also the influence that he got from Buddhism and from Zhang Taiyan. So that's one topic I've been working on. Another topic I've been working on recently is Zhu Hao, the Japanese intellectual Takeuchi Yoshimi. So Takeuchi Yoshimi was somebody who studied Chinese literature at Tokyo University in the early 1930s. And as a graduate student, he set up a small research group that studied modern Chinese literature. And he was interested, of course, in Lu Xun. He never met Lu Xun while he was alive, although they actually were in Shanghai at the same time at one point. But in the early 1940s, I would say 1944, 43, 44, he sat down to write a book because he hadn't been inducted into the army yet. And the book was entitled simply Rojin, Lu Xun. The book was very influential. It was published in 1945 when he was actually in the army already. He'd been conscripted into the Japanese army and sent to Hunan, where he worked in intelligence. And as you probably know, the war was already going against Japan in Hunan at that time. He thought he would die. So the book he wrote, Rojin Lu Xun, was actually intended as his swan song. Here I am, I'm a young scholar, I'm going to be sent into war, a war that I don't support, and a war that I don't think is a good idea, and I'll probably die and not come back, so I want to write down this book before I leave. The book was very influential in Japan after World War II, because after the war was over, Japan was occupied by the American military. And so Japanese intellectuals read this book, and they began to identify with Lu Xun as a dissident intellectual in China in the 1920s and 30s, a China which is in part occupied by imperialist powers, right? Chairman Mao called it semi-colonial, semi-feudal, right? And somebody who is not in favor of any of that, but is forced to live under it. Somebody who's not in favor of the government, right? The Japanese intellectuals after the war, most of them were not in favor of the emperor's system, but they were forced to live under that and under the American military occupation. Most of them have never, ever supported the war effort during the war either, but yet the consequences they felt fell on them. Right, so in a way then, for the Japanese intellectuals who read Takeuchi's book, Lu Xun became a model for an intellectual of integrity living in this compromised situation in East Asia. So Lu Xun's status rose very high in Japan in the 1950s and 60s, and arguably continues to be very high now in Japan. In fact, one could argue that what Takeuchi did with this book was really quite amazing, because Lu Xun in China, in a way, his position is the position that he himself eked out, the position that he himself earned. It's not on the basis of anything any scholar wrote, including me, right? But in Japan, because of this one book, people realized how important Lu Xun was. So one thing I've done is I've been working with an American scholar who's a professor in Canada called Josh Fogel. And we've been translating this book into English from the Japanese, which is difficult. And there are two different Chinese translations, one done in the 1980s and another one done more recently in the aughties, I believe. And I also look at these two Chinese translations when I'm trying to read the original. And we want to translate the whole thing into English because we think it was important. Important in East Asia because the Koreans like it too. The Koreans are reading it as well. Important in East Asia. And now it's important because Chinese scholars are starting to study the impact of Takeuchi Yoshimi in Japan. And their reaction to this is also a phenomenon. It's also an intellectual phenomenon. So I'm interested in that part of it too. What's the Chinese reaction to the Japanese reaction to this book and to Lu Xun? So it sort of goes in circles. But I find it intriguing, and it's a chance for me to torture myself with Japanese yet again. And the third thing I'm interested in, which is I'm very fortunate to have gotten the Biden administration's version of the Fulbright grant to do research in China. It's called the China-U.S. Scholars Program Fellowship. So I will be going to China in August or September for a stay of 4 or 5 months. And I will be working on Lai Shengchuan in China. Lai Shengchuan, as you know, is a Taiwan playwright, but he's very active in China, in mainland China now. In Shanghai, because he has his own theater there. He also has a theater school there. He's also a very important founder and person who works on this Wuzhen Xiju Jie. The Wuzhen Theater Festival.
That's famous.
Yeah, it's really famous and it's really good. So what I want to do is write something about his work in mainland China. Because in mainland China, his work today in mainland China is more important than the work he does in Taiwan. For one thing, he's welcome and he's encouraged in mainland China. The problem with Taiwan is whenever the Minjindang, the DPP, get into power, they view him as somebody who's pro-mainland, and so they don't like him. And I think this is a very narrow way of approaching literature, because Lai Shengchuan is not really a political writer. He writes about culture, he writes about emotion, he writes about international themes, but he's not really a political writer per se. So I think that Minjindang has made a mistake in buttonholing him, stamping him as a pro-mainland writer. I think he's somebody who understands the history of the Chinese diaspora, and he's somebody who writes about the Chinese experience in the diaspora. Some of his critics say the problem with Lai Shengchuan is he writes about his parents' generation. He doesn't write about his own generation. But I think the thing about it is this is my take too. History is important because it tells us how we got to where we are now.
Yes.
Right? It's not just about something in the past, it's also about the present.
Right.
And I think that that's why his work still speaks to audiences, and why it speaks to audiences both in mainland China and in Taiwan and even in the Chinese diaspora. Anlian Taohuayuan, for instance. It speaks to many different people for many different reasons. They even performed it in English in Ashland, in Oregon. And one of the lecturers here, Xia Meng, actually went to Oregon during that and did a sort of a survey of the audience. How did you understand this? And I think that's one of the great things about literature is sometimes it's able to cross over cultures and speak to people in totally different cultures. There was a movie made by a Chinese director from, I believe he's from Hong Kong, might have been from Taiwan, called Lei Wangzi, Prince of Tears. It's a story about Bai Se Kong Bu, the White Terror in Taiwan. A story about two little girls in Taiwan in the very early 1950s who live a charmed life. Their father is a pilot in the Kuomintang Air Force, and their mother is a beautiful, beautiful young woman, and they have a wonderful life, and then suddenly the father disappears. And then suddenly the mother disappears, and so they're left alone. And the story is what happened is the father was executed by the Kuomintang, and then the mother was executed by the Kuomintang. The question is why? The father, being in the Air Force, was always told, you're allowed to make one big mistake because the government trusts you. Just one big mistake. After that, you get in trouble with one big mistake. What was his big mistake? He had left the older of the two girls in the mainland. And one night he flew back to the mainland and got her, and then flew back to Taiwan. And then they found out that he had done this, and so they shot him, and then they shot his wife too. But the reason I tell the story is, I saw this film here in Sydney at the Sydney Film Festival, and virtually the entire audience were white Australians. And at the end of the film, they all stood up and gave it a standing ovation. And I was so impressed that, all the complications of Taiwan politics and the White Terror and all, and the movie still spoke to them. And it didn't speak to the backers in Hong Kong, and it didn't speak to the backers in Taiwan anymore. And the director was there, and he talked about that, how he'd lost funding and so on and so forth. But yet, the movie, as a work of art, was able to transcend these different cultures and different histories. And it was a huge audience, and they all stood up and applauded. So I was very moved by that. Not just by the story, but by the power of literature. And another anecdote is, some years before that, I met one of these little girls. She was already an old lady, and I met her in Berkeley, California, at a Chinese temple. And I was introduced to her by the, what shall I call him? Da Shi, the master of the temple at the time. But that ended up being the historical prototype for one of the two girls in the movie. So, in a way, my life goes in a big circle as well.
Okay, so as the first professor of Chinese studies at the University of New South Wales, Sydney, what have you hoped to achieve by your work here, and what are your expectations for students here?
Well, I came here from the University of Melbourne, and I came here because I thought that I would have a better chance of developing Chinese studies in Australia than I had at the University of Melbourne, because at the time the University of Melbourne was very political, and those of us who were in Chinese studies felt that it was very restrictive on what we could do. Here at UNSW at the time, it was very optimistic. The dean at the time was an Asianist, a man called John. Oh my God, I'm forgetting the name. He was an Asianist, and he studied Indonesian history, and he very much favored developing Chinese studies here, and so that's why I came here. I had a great deal of enthusiasm at the time when I first got to Sydney. I actually wrote some columns for a Chinese newspaper called Huadong Shibao.
Oh, I know that.
Yeah, it was one of the oldest Chinese newspapers here.
Yes.
And at that time, it was run by a Malaysian Chinese businessman. But yeah, I wrote several columns, several articles for them, including one called Derrida 在 Sydney. Derrida, that is the French philosopher in Sydney, because he came here and gave a lecture at Town Hall. I tried to explain his ideas on deconstruction using Lao Zhuang 思想, using Taoist philosophy. At any rate, I came here with a lot of enthusiasm. I think that Chinese studies could have gotten more support from the administration than it did. I think that one of the problems is that we were marginalized. But I don't think that that's necessarily a problem at UNSW alone. I think the marginalization of Chinese studies and Asian studies is a major problem in Western academia. So that's not really about UNSW per se.
Yeah.
And what we need to do is, as I said before, is somehow fight our way out of this marginalization into the center, into the mainstream. I think that's the main challenge that is before us as sinologists. And secondly, you asked me about expectations for students. You know, one of the comments I keep getting from students over and over again is they say they are confused.
Why?
And I hadn't heard this until recent years. And I keep wondering why students feel confused all the time. I keep thinking maybe it's because there's so much information out there on the internet now.
Yes.
And there are all these one-liners, and there are all these 视频. And of course the 视频 tend to be very short visual things, like on TikTok or what have you, or on YouTube. And in a way, these things can't really substitute for reading. I know that, for instance, I recently gave a student a copy of Yang Jiang's essays, and the student said, hey, this is really interesting. But unless you sit down and start reading the essays, you won't know that. You won't be able to benefit from reading. So I think that one thing that I would like to see students do more here is just do more reading. Less 视频, less of these TikTok videos and YouTube videos, and more actual reading. And I think if they did more reading, they might feel less confused. Confusion, I think, is really, it's understandable, because it's a reaction to the world today, and the world today is very confusing. We have the war in Ukraine, and what's going on there. Is it should Ukraine be victorious and drive Russia completely out of its own borders, or should there be peace talks? I mean, what do you do in a situation like this war in Europe? A lot of Europeans are just very, very dazed by this. And I suppose dazed is another way of saying confused. What's going on? How is this possible? You look at Afghanistan, you look at the rising tensions in Nanhai, in the South China Sea, and you wonder what's going on. I mean, the tension between Taiwan and mainland China. I mean, there used to be a communist slogan at the beginning of the Kanghe Jianzhang, the war to resist Japan. 自己人不打自己人, right? We don't fight our own people, right? So I mean, this is, like I was saying the other day in China Imagined and Perceived, when the Opium War was first proposed in the British Parliament, there were a lot of people who opposed it, including the Duke of Wellington, who was the general who defeated Napoleon. He said there's no reason to have a war against China. Yeah. We can solve all these things diplomatically. How can you send a naval expedition against China? This is ridiculous. So, I mean, there are certain things that I think we can reason our way through. I'm not saying that there are absolute standards of right and wrong. I think that's one of the things that I learned from Lao Zhuang 思想 from Taoism, that, you know, to a certain extent, right and wrong is subjective. But yet I think that there are ways of coming to an understanding. I think there are ways to have peace. There's been peace in the Taiwan Straits since 1945. And I think that peace can continue. I think that reunification is possible by peaceful means. I think that the status quo can continue by peaceful means. I think that one of the things that I worry about is outside intervention. If you look at the Middle East, if you look at Israel and Palestine and all this fighting, Lebanon, so on and so forth, Iraq, Syria, Iran, these people in the 19th century under the Ottoman Empire, at least in Israel and Palestine, they lived at peace. I think it was only after the intervention of the imperialist powers and redrawing of maps and so on and so forth that there came to be tension, because imperialist powers were backing certain groups against other groups. And I think that the whole area was destabilized through this imbalance. And I think that that's probably also the case with Eastern Europe and now with Ukraine, that the area has been destabilized by too much foreign influence. So I've probably said more than enough.
That's enough. Yeah, thank you so much. And we are so appreciate to have you here for our interview. And that's it. Thank you for today.
I'm grateful to you for your interest.